And we're recording again. Right, welcome to the first proper pod this week after the introduction, where we're looking at notions of place from the perspective of cultural geography. And in this pod, we're going to look at perhaps the three key fundamental building blocks that every book on cultural geography seems to reference. And that's the notion of location, locale, and sense of place. The first of Agnew and Duncan's kind of building blocks of the notion of place is this notion of location. And this perhaps is the most objective, most apparently straightforward notion of place. It is, where is it? How can we locate this place from perhaps points of longitude or latitude on a map? The first thing perhaps we do, even in junior school, is learn how to do grid references, that much east and that far north, or x-axis or y-axis, to be able to locate it on a map. And we can see some examples of this here, perhaps just outside Stokescroft in Bristol, 5102. It alludes to its longitude and latitude. We've got Cardiff's location there, or down in Swansea at the bottom. A particular development in the marina in actually SA1 is designated by its point, longitude and latitude, its distance in relation to other spaces. So the first point, I suppose, in which we can draw attention to here is location is kind of scientific, it's kind of global, it's a point on a map, so we can get to it, we know where it is, everybody can have a fixed idea of where that location is. But also, it's also relational in the same sense, because it's all in relation to something else. Other ways which we could think about this notion of location is, as in the SA1 development there, in terms of perhaps postcodes. We don't really use longitude and latitude in our day-to-day lives, do we? We're not ancient mariners, although maybe our satellite navigation systems in our cars might. But we do use postcodes. And we might know our postcodes. We might know our postcodes in order to use our Zoom, our TomToms, etc. in our cars, or through our phones. TomToms, how old am I? But we might use our postcodes. And even in this apparently straightforward notion, this scientific distanced objective point of location, we are slipping straight away. We're moving away, as soon as we think about postcodes, we're moving away into an understanding of place that is quite personal in nature. That's invoked by this picture on the right hand side that Kirsty and Phil will be going, the three most important things about buying a house is location, location and location. And that's kind of invoked here in terms of latitude. Again, another point of longitude in that. The right place, the right price, right here. You might be able to set up your home in a location. And as soon as you're setting up home, you're making it personal. You're making it part and parcel of who you are. And this is something that Agnew draws upon here. Okay, we'll listen to the quote and then I'll talk about it. In the simplest sense, Agnew says, space refers to location somewhere, and place refers to the occupation of that location. So perhaps he's trying to move here from an understanding an objective, soulless space into a humanized and lived-in place. But he's using the term location for both, okay? And the point I'm trying to get at here is that as we go from location to locale to sense of place, perhaps we're becoming more personal and perhaps becoming more humanized through this process. We might start in the objective sciencey bit, but even in location, we're being sucked into the notion of place. As Agnew confirms, space is about having an address, but place is about living at that address, as the previous slide about this could be your home suggests. Now, back in the days when we used to go into Glamorgan Building, sometimes I used to cycle into work, and I used to cycle through Cathay Cemetery. Of course I did. What a lovely thing to do on the way to school. But I came across these two gravestones, probably on a rainy day, and I was taking shelter. I don't normally go around reading gravestones. What do you think I am? Don't answer. Right. Anyway, these gravestones sort of suggest what Agnew is talking about here, in loving memory of John Jones of 8 Ryder Street, 1845 to 1922. Just imagine 100 years later, when we're living, that they would put our address on our gravestone. Because in those days, people used to live at one address forever. You've lived at 27 billion addresses already, and you're only like 20 years old. Maybe you put your Gmail account on your address these days, on your gravestone these days, rather than your actual physical address. But this is suggesting that location can be lived in, that can come almost to define us. Simply the house where we live, that's us. Oh yeah, that's John Jones from Ryder Street. That's Samuel from Plasburton Avenue on the other gravestone. I think that's quite, it almost kind of just puts me back in my place and thinks, wow, we live quite mobile lives, but hasn't always been the case. And location perhaps is a really useful starting point to begin understanding what this analytical category of place is. Okay. And then, even if we think maybe location isn't that today, there's a couple of really interesting things that you can click on or go through or whatever to say the way that actually our postcode might come to define us, even in the contemporary things and articles about young people, youth culture in London in particular, but there's lots of other different examples here where postcode comes to define their identity. If you cross the street between E5 and E9, you might risk being attacked because you're not from that, you're not in that gang, you're not from that area, you're not from that location. And even this palimpsest style graffiti here, CF14 have claimed that area, but then CF5 have overwritten it and say, no, this is our area. They're claiming that location through that cultural trace. So maybe location is perhaps more useful than simply that, where is it on a map? Perhaps it can have the living, breathing aspect of human life as part of it too. And here we see location almost morphing into and blending quite nicely into this notion of locale. Agnew and Duncan's second big aspect of the notion of place. So what does locale mean? Locale, according to Agnew and Duncan, refers to the broader context for social relations. We might be referring to the built and social environment. We might be referring to those inherited cultural traces of statues and architecture and roads and fields and parks and plazas, and almost like the big durable stuff that comes to define it. We might go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre because that's the broader context for social relations. We might go because we might assume that Paris might have a lovely cafe culture, or they might be all fashionable and there's all like an open kind of what's the catwalk down every street, beautiful people doing beautiful things and smoking gauloises and going into the Musée d'Orsay and going into the Louvre. This might be the broader setting for everyday routine that becomes part and parcel of our cultural vocabulary, our cultural imagination, I should say, when we think about a particular place. When you think about the City of London, you might think about a financial district. When you think about, the Norfolk Broads, you might have a picture in your imagination of the type of physical and cultural environment that's there, that's associated with that area. So it's quite broad, and it might be quite collectively understood, but it's almost like the thumbnail sketches of what these places are like. Okay, so in the same way that locale morphed out of location, sense of place morphs out of locale, and maybe we're going from the generic and the scientific through to the collectively understood, through perhaps to the far more individual here, but I'll leave that for you to decide. Agnew and Duncan suggested that sense of place refers to the subjective feelings, the attachment that individuals have to place, the sorts of values that people put on their environment. It all alludes to the sense that we belong in a place. And Krang beautifully sums up what sense of place refers to here. Approaches to place have suggested the vital importance of a sense of belonging to human beings. The basic geography of life, however, is not encapsulated in a series of map grid references. It's not simply encapsulated by the notion of location. It extends beyond the notion of location, perhaps into ideas of locale too. But Krang would go further. He says, crucially, people do not simply locate themselves in the world. They define themselves in that world. They define themselves, how? Through a sense of place. They define themselves by the cultural traces that they have an affinity with, that they tie themselves into, that they perform on a day-to-day basis, the anthems that they stand for, the anthems that they kneel for, the tattoos they have placed upon their body, the hashtags they put on their email, the teams that they support at the weekend. This might be during the Six Nations, as Sam Warburton said, well, crikey, 2005, I'm fired up for summer. The point I'm getting at here is hashtag I am Wales. Wales is not a place, a nation that is abstract or simply defined by its location. It's defined by the defining category that defines the body here. I am Wales. I'm the Splot division, or I'm made in Roath, below the nation state. As Sachs said in the prologue, it might be at the nation state, it might just be really low down. It might be that, see that little picture I did on the bottom left hand side, a map, and Cardiff, the Cardiff's part of my heart, maybe. I'm defined by these things. You can take the girl out of Wales, but you can't take Wales out of the girl. All these things are suggesting that we define ourselves by a sense of place. As Prieto cites here, first the body. No, the body doesn't exist in isolation. First the place. No, we can't have the place just in isolation. First both. We are connected to the places around us. We are defined by the places around. These three aspects of place can perhaps give us our sense of who we are, give us our place in the world. We could perhaps ask ourselves, and maybe you want to take a few minutes to do this for yourself, how you can identify your sense of belonging through notions of location, notions of locale, and notions of sense of place. What defines this place? What are its key traces to you? If you were doing a satire of your place, like that one of Newport, what would it be for its location, its locale, and its sense of place, perhaps? If you don't want to necessarily do it for your place, you can have a look at this web link, www, and look at a little film done by Drone Boy. Okay, I think it's the second one down on the page, and it's all about the Tiger Bay junglists, and all about he introduces his company, he introduces his graffiti, he introduces the way in which he's making the world, but also the way he feels as if it's tied into the place of Cardiff. And perhaps go through that and have a little think about the utility of Agnew and Duncan's initial description of place as location, locale, and sense of place in understanding this analytical category. Okay, I'll see you in the next pod.